Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to my studio. Today, in this particular class, you will be learning about how to paint trees. Trees can be a little tricky, and understanding the shapes and the tones will help you to be able to paint them in color. And so that's what you'll be doing in this three-part video. You'll be, first of all, painting your trees in tonal value, which is light and dark, understanding that they have a shape and a color and a light pattern. And then we'll be translating that information into color. And along the way, you'll probably hear a student in the background asking questions, possibly the types of things that you'll be thinking about as you do this. And I hope that will be helpful to you too. So let's go over to the table and let's see how we can start this particular subject. So I hope you enjoy the video. What we're doing in this class is to explore the idea of painting trees, explore the idea of foliage in landscapes so that we have a lot of information to be able to pull out of our pockets when we're ready to paint, okay? Mm-hmm. And the first part of that is that everything that we paint has a silhouette, and it doesn't matter whether it's a tree, a cup, a teapot, or whatever. And so we have to understand that silhouettes need to be recognizable. And so if you see a lot of foliage that is not recognizable, you either avoid that or you try and choose something that maybe is a little more recognizable so that when you paint it, it looks like the subject that you're going to paint. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes.
So that's really important to start with. The way the source material that you use for your painting really has to have enough information in it, light and shadow information and shape information, for you to be able to paint the subject clearly. If you can't see it clearly in your photograph or in your outside painting, then your viewer of your painting will not understand it either. So does that make sense? If you're struggling to try and represent something that you can't see, it's not going to translate very well to your painting. So it's really key to choose something that has a good shape and a good light source. And so when we put a light source on these shapes, this is kind of what we get. Mm-hmm. All right, we get a pattern of light and shadow. And why do we need that? Well, we need that because the pattern of light and shadow allows us to look at the subject dimensionally. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, that makes sense.
And so we're going to do this whole little practice page here in tonal values so that you have an idea of how that works. And then we're going to translate that tonal value into color.
Oh, I love that.
Okay.
That is cool.
Yeah. Okay, good. So this is the one we did that you missed the other day, and so this is how we'll be working on this today. We won't extend it into the complete colors yet, but basically this is what we're going to do. So we're going to start with the trees that are the easiest to understand. So let me move this out of the way. We're going to mix up a mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna gray. I'll go over to the palette so you can see that. And ultramarine blue is here, and you'll need a fair amount of this paint because we're going to paint all of them. So I'll make quite a big mixture. And your paint should always be nice and wet. And I'll pull in some burnt sienna just to make it into a gray. It can be a blue gray, it doesn't matter, a middle of the road gray, or really doesn't matter at all. But it's going to be about a middle tone or just a little bit darker. So we'll test that on a piece of paper here. Let's find a piece that doesn't have much happening. And that's about where you want to go. And when we look at that in relation to the tape that I use, we're not taping around the outside edge, it's just a little darker than the purple tape. Okay, so it's like a darker mid-tone. And it's about the same as the blue tape that we used to use before we could get the lilac tape. Okay? You see the difference there? You see that? It's just a little darker than that. And that's what I use as a guide to how dark and how light the colors are.
Okay.
So when you're ready, you've got your paint ready. Yeah?
I think my paint is a little grayer than yours,
That's
but
okay.
it looks like it's about the same.
Yeah, that's fine. The color isn't important. It's the tone that's a little bit more important. So we're going to start with the trees that are easier. And what we're going to do first of all is to add a light source to the tree. So let's go back to the table here and we'll work on this. So we'll start with the trees in the center here because they're pretty easy shaped to recognize. They could be cypress trees or fir trees of any kind. Sometimes these go up, sometimes they go down. It just depends on the tree. Yeah. And so I put two together so that you can see the light and shadow on both of them. And what we're going to do here is to put the shadow in. We're going to make a light source that comes from one direction or the other. We'll start with this one. So that tells us our light source. Okay, that says the light is coming from this side. And now we're going to paint the back side, the shadow side. And as we do that, we're going to divide the tree kind of in half by putting in just a little bit of paint, following the outline of the tree, letting it go across in a few places because that's always kind of how it works, and then taking it across the base like that. Okay. So that's giving us that pattern of light and dark going through the tree. Now the tree behind will be exactly the same, but we'll leave the white side, the light side white. Now if you were painting this in color, you'd probably do the light side in a lighter green. Okay, and then of course we always have a cast shadow, and there might be a little cast shadow that comes in this direction from this tree, and maybe just a little bit more of that direction from that tree. This one's a little taller.
Okay,
so now it's your turn. You go ahead and do that.
What do I do with my paintbrush? There it is.
I'm using a number 8 paintbrush here.
Oh, I don't have enough paint on there. So when you make the cast shadow, is it any special shape? It's supposed to be the shape of the tree, isn't it?
Yes, effectively it's going to be the tree, but it's going to be a flattened version of the tree because the ground is flat.
Okay.
But you can kind of wing it a little bit for this. This isn't as quite as important. It just needs to come away from the tree in the same direction as the light. Okay. Normally the cast shadow would follow the form of the ground that it sits on. So if the ground goes up and down, the cast shadow would go up and down.
Okay.
And we're leaving little gaps in between. And this is what separates the tree. The light and shadow is what gives any subject, not just the tree, any subject dimension. Okay, so whenever we want something to look three-dimensional, we're going to make sure we have light and shadow. You okay with that?
Yeah.
So I've just pulled the shadow out just a little bit on the side there. And to make this work, in reality, if there's a light side on this side, what we'd have to do is to just put a dark on the back side, okay, and turn it into a little background area.
Okay.
See how that would work? Right?
Okay.
And so that's something you don't need to do today if you don't want to, or you could you could have your light source coming from the other direction. It doesn't matter. I did it the other way around on this one, but I'm doing both here so you can see.
Okay. So what you just painted where you added that and it gave the left side of that tree some shape?
Yes.
That could be like sky or it could be mountains.
You got it. Absolutely. Okay. It could be sky, it could be mountains. And so that is basically, it's a negative space back there. It's the background space. And it would go around all of the trees like this. It would follow on, right? It wouldn't just be around the one tree. And so it would
go
be
all the way around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It would be whatever was in your subject that would allow these trees to pop out like that. And so we use that idea of light against dark every time we paint, every subject. I'm always talking to you about light against dark, yeah? And that's basically what I've done.
Yeah. And what you just did, painting that around, now when I'm looking at it, you see the dimension, right? I can see sort of the shapes of those trees.
Exactly. It's a little more difficult to see it when you don't have that background around this side. Yeah?
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
easier to see it when you have the background around this side. Yeah?
Very cool.
Okay.
I'm really enjoying this. I can't tell you how much.
Excellent.
Because this, I think, is the part that I've had struggled a lot with, just trying to understand, well, first, how to see that dark, and then how to express it with the paint.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's...
But knowing now that, it's going to show up in one side or...
Well, if you use a single directional light source from one side only, you will get the most dimension that you can get in anything, okay? Like, remember when we paint the cups in class and we paint apples and we paint pears and peppers? It's the same idea. You'll get the most dimension if the light is coming from one side only. If the light's above, or if the light's not bright enough to be able to light up the object, then the dimension is hard to get. So that's why when you take pictures of your subjects for painting, it's a really good idea to make sure the light is good.
Okay, so when you did the back, the outline around it,
I lightened it up just a little bit. I
put more water.
Yeah, just a little bit more water in the mix.
Okay. Let me see if I can, see, I'm not quite, yeah. Okay, that's kind of working. Okay, cool.
So everything that we paint has shapes, then tonal value, then color, and then we think about texture and edges. In that order, everything. Okay, so right now we're looking at the shapes and we're looking at the tonal value. And the tonal value is just light and dark. Okay, and then we try to translate that tonal value into color. And most artists will do samples or sketches of paintings before they start to plan and to save time. Because if you figure it out like this in tone, then it's much easier to go paint it in color because you already know where the lights and the darks are. When you're trying to work out the lights and the darks and the color at the same time, it becomes more difficult. It's more of a challenge. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense.
Good, yeah, because it really is, I'm the wrong way around here. There we go. It really is important to know how this works, So we're going to go over to the little bushes now. And the same idea happens on the bushes. Let's have the light coming from the same direction just to make it easier.
Okay.
The same idea, right, in that each little bush is going to have a light side and then a shadow side. So if this is the light side of this bush, because the light's coming from here, the shadow is going to go around the back of the bush like this. Okay. And then we're going to soften it out with a little bit of a damp brush and just let it come out into there. And then we're going to skip the light side here, and we're going to have another shadow from this little bush coming in this direction. Okay? So the darks against the lights allow you to see each other. Allow you to see...
The edge that you soften is on the light side?
Is on the light side, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So
and
that
the sharp,
can be softened or blurry.
It could
whereas
be.
The other edge can be more
pretty sharp, yes, because the other edge is more defined. It's more of a bush shape, and so we want to define that edge, and we want to soften this shadow edge here, and it goes in and out of the bush usually, and down at the bottom as well. And we'll try not to make a straight line across. We'll try to make it a bit more interesting, so it has more of a bushy shape. And that goes on ad infinitum. You can do it, So this is how we separate bushes and shrubs when we're painting them. We separate them with shadow, and there'll be just a little bit of shadow at the base here, connecting all of those together, in and out, just a bit. Going in here and in here. And that will give the idea, I'll do that just a little bit darker. And that'll give you the idea of how the bushes look. Let's just soften those edges just a wee bit more. So we have a bit more shape in that.
Okay.
Yeah? And sometimes you won't need a soft edge. Sometimes it'll be a sharper edge too, because it'll have, it'll be a bit more defined. It depends on the bush.
Okay.
But this is really good practice for understanding light and dark. And I'm actually going to do a little webinar on tone.
That would be good.
Yeah, because it's very important to know how that works. We could have just a little light coming over the top of that one too. Okay?
Okay.
All right, so you've got that. So we're working kind of towards the more difficult ones. We'll go back up here now to this one. And this is a similar idea. It's similar to this tree, but the shapes are a little different. They go in a different direction. So we can decide we'll have the light come from this side on this one, just for a change, so you get used to this idea of light and shadow and how it works. Yeah. All right. I'm just mixing up a little bit more paint here, and I'll be ready to go. Okay. So now that's just a wee bit too dark. Now we're going to go on the left-hand side. Now will be the shadow side. And we're going to just run that paint in and out of the edges to give it a nice, interesting silhouette. And then we're going to come within the tree and just allow some of it to go across just a little bit more, because the light flows in and out of those little tree patterns, little foliage patterns. And there's always going to be more shadow at the base of the tree, always, usually over to the light side as well. And there might be just a little bit more shadow, maybe just a few little shadows underneath the edges of this side too, on this type of tree.
Okay. And that's more like a pine tree maybe even
exactly.
a cypress, depending on the shape of it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So what you're going to do is you're going to be looking for these light patterns that flow across the tree. And sometimes it'll go just a little bit further across there.
Okay.
Okay with that? And you'll have just a little bit of shadow oftentimes underneath those edges on the light side. Okay, and this one has a trunk, and so the trunk pattern is the same as the light source. So paint the left-hand side of the trunk with paint, and then just make a soft edge with your damp brush and let that flow over to the right side.
Okay. A little too much water on that part, but that's okay. It came out okay.
Yeah, how much water and how much paint is always a challenge. Okay, and now the shadow for this one, we'll make it go in this direction. So you'll see a little bit of shadow here. You won't see the shadow of the trunk because this will be covering it, but we'll just take a little bit of a shape across here and take it out like that sort of shape. Okay, so it can come out more like that. And sometimes it will be on the other side too.
And does that lower shadow always connect to the trunk?
Yes, absolutely. It starts from the trunk.
Okay.
Yes. And you'll see that more when we do the palm trees up there.
Okay.
Now, usually one tone is not going to be enough. Okay, so I'm using just one tone. Normally, we'll have to go back in and add in a few darker tones. Okay, so this is just giving you the pattern of the light and shadow, the depth of the light and shadow, and we'll do that a little bit more when we do the oak tree. We'll add in some more dark, so you see how that works. But this is more about the pattern to start with. Okay, this is a eucalyptus down here, so we're going to leave that for the moment. We're going to go to this one, which is something along the lines of, I'll pull that out for you, something along the lines of a redwood tree or a cypress tree. And they usually have foliage that goes across and kind of links together. Sometimes it's separate, sometimes it's, connected. And if the light is coming from, let's say, this direction, all right, for this one. It doesn't really matter about the light direction so much because normally these trees are in a forest area and the light is filtering through the trees and it's coming from above, okay? So normally these little goodies are going to be lit from above. And so you'll put a shadow actually underneath each one of them. And sometimes they'll come across here just a little bit. And so you'll get that feeling of flow across the subject. And that can be softened just a bit on the top. So it's not too much of a line, it becomes a bit more of a tone. Okay. So that's kind of the pattern of the foliage on these. It's more of that idea. And then the trunks will be exactly the same. You will possibly see a light and a shadow on the trunk. So we'll go to the shadow side, which will be on the right, if the light's coming from the left. Within the branches, you probably won't see much difference because the light will be filtered. You might see just a little tiny bit of light, but most of the time the branches and the trunks within the foliage will be darker. And we'll just make this a little bit lighter on each side. And we'll put in a little bit of tone here, a shadow tone underneath. Leave a few little lights showing. And that's kind of what we're doing with our shadow pattern on that one. And sometimes these will be just a little bit darker on the edges there. And one thing that I told the rest of the class earlier was that you really need to know your subject. Okay, so when you're painting something, the more you know about it, the easier it is to paint. So good idea to learn a little bit more about tree shapes, and once you understand what you're looking for, you'll be able to do this much more easily. You'll be able to learn a little bit more. And then when you paint, it'll be easier for you to do that because when you know something, it's much easier to paint it. So this is a sample of a little redwood area. You see that?
Oh, yes.
Now you have the idea. So sometimes they angle a bit, sometimes they're straight. It just depends on, how you're looking at it.
On the subject, yeah. Okay.
So we're working from the easier ones to the harder ones as far as shapes go. And the harder ones are going to be the eucalyptus and the oak tree because sometimes they're not lit well and sometimes they're not, they're very complicated, so they're hard to determine.
So on some of the trees, depending on the kind of tree it is, there's little white spots.
Yes.
Like you say for the birds to fly through.
Exactly. Spaces between.
More dense,
yes.
right?
Yes, exactly. And so usually the spaces for the birds to fly through will be more around the outside edges, sometimes in the center, but quite often it's more around the outside edges, particularly of the oak trees and that type of tree, a beech tree or something like that. Sometimes the eucalyptus are a little more open within the tree. They have areas of foliage that fall down and then you can see within the tree. So it depends on the tree, but yes. And the one thing you need to know about those holes where the birds fly through is that if you've painted a sky across your tree before you start, and then you paint the foliage, the holes within the tree are going to look lighter than the sky. So more often than not, you have to make them look a little bit darker within the tree. Okay? Just, it's a visual, it's an optical illusion.
Okay,
I'm going to move to a number 6 brush now, and we're going to paint these palm trees. Okay? And same idea. Now, palm trees are lit from above quite often, so let's find a light source. We'll go in this direction for this one, and a 45-degree angle light source is a good one. We don't want the light right above us, because if we have that, the shadow, there's no shadow. Everything is light and everything is dark at the bottom, so there's no shape to the subject if we have that. What we want is a sideways light source. Okay, so for these little guys, we can just use the brush and we can paint some fronds and leave just the top edges a little bit white. And so if you were painting this in color, your top edges could be raw sienna or light green for these guys. And we'll put a little dark in the center. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Right, and follow those through, and we'll just do all of these, and then we'll come back and do the trunks. So usually the light is coming from above, so that the top edge of the fronds, when it's against the light, is light. And then any areas in between are going to be a little bit darker. And usually the center of these are just a little bit darker. Okay, so you can paint these. Yeah.
The center of these, is it like when you paint a flower? I
well,
was trying to paint these the other day, and I couldn't figure out, well, what does the center really look like?
Yeah, and that's a good thing. Let me just find that picture for you, and I can show you that. So it depends on what type of palm it is. Okay, if it's a coconut palm or a date palm, it depends on what it is. So usually these guys will be light at the top, like this. Then underneath there'll be a shadow, and there might be some goodies hanging down here, some seeds or dates or whatever. But underneath each one of these, and on the top it's light, underneath there's a shadow.
It's dark, okay.
And very loosely you can paint it like this. Okay, really loosely.
Okay.
So basically this area is darker, but it's not a big solid area. It's broken up a little bit. Make sense?
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And so these guys, we're just, you will be painting these trees later. We're just working on the tones right now, just to give you an idea of what to look for when you have the color. Okay. And then we'll be going through each of these trees in the rest of the class so that you know exactly how they work. And I'll give you a few tips for loosening up a little bit too for the trees, because it helps. Okay, now this trunk on these will be shadowed on the back side, okay, because the light's coming from the left, so the trunk shadow will be on the right. And normally you would soften it down, but these are just too small to do that.
Okay.
And so we won't worry too much about that. And then our cast shadow now is where you'll see the trunk coming out. You see the cast shadow coming out over the sand, and you see the trunk, and then it comes out into a flat sort of area of what's happening on the tree.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of squished sideways. Can you see that?
Yeah. I see that.
Yeah. And then this also here, same idea. The trunk, we can have one coming out here and one coming out there. That's the trunk. And then this one's a little taller, so it comes down. It's like a little flat shape of what's happening in the tree. And
okay,
this one will
so it's kind of like the palm fronds, but
exactly, those are the palm fronds, and this is the trunk. So as far as the shadow goes, that's what you're seeing. Now the sand goes up and down, so the shadow goes up and down. Shadow follows the shape of the ground. So the cast shadow tells us about the subject, but it also tells us about the ground that the subject is sitting on. Yeah?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So go ahead and do those. And then we're going to work on the next two.
I like doing these tonal values because that helps, it just helps the brain connect with light versus dark and the shapes, right? Making shapes that ultimately, in the different tones and colors, create like you said, the silhouette of whatever it is we're painting.
Right. So the silhouette starts out the process, and then the tones that we put on makes the silhouette become dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at it in 3 dimensions rather than just flat, like a flat silhouette. Yeah.
Yeah, very good.
Excellent. Good. So now we'll go back to our number 8 brush and mix up a little more paint here, and we're going to work on the oak tree at the top.
Okay.
And this is one of the more difficult trees to do. The deciduous trees like this that are canopied are always hard. So we'll look at the photographs that I gave you. You can pull your page of photographs out. We'll use those right now to just give us some idea of shapes. Just find that. And it's behind this one. Okay, so we can use this oak tree here. This is one that's just down the road from where I live. We can use this with the light source that's coming from the right. Can you see that? So this side of the tree is pretty much lighter. Okay. And when you look at a tree like this, you're going to notice that it has, not only does it have an interesting silhouette shape like this, okay, and this is a California live oak, so it's going to be something, it's going to be an oak that's a little squatter and flatter than an eastern oak. So our oaks in California are a little bit different, the ones that are evergreen. Normally in the East Coast, the oak would be taller, and in England, the oak would be a taller tree. And I wrote about that on the tree varieties, so you can look at that. But here, our oaks hug the ground, and so they're actually drought resistant, and the leaves are more like holly leaves rather than oak leaves. They're stiff, right? Because they're drought tolerant. They have to live in this hot climate. And so we have the outline of the oak, right? And then within that outline, you'll see there are clumps of foliage. Can you see that? And they're kind of mushroom shaped. If you look at it, it's like a sphere. Right? Let me just go back into this little sample that I have here, so I can explain that to you. They're a little bit like a sphere, and in nature, there are 4 basic shapes that we can kind of say everything follows. This could be a fir tree, right, or a cypress tree. This could be a trunk, right? This could be a body. This could be an arm. The cube sometimes is man-made, usually is man-made. But as far as the natural world goes, these are the 3 that we see shapes. So we're looking at a sphere, and the way that light falls on these shapes gives us an idea of how to paint an object that comes from these shapes, or that could be these shapes. So overall, our oak tree has a light side and a shadow side, like the sphere. This is the light side, this is the shadow side. And within each area of the tree, there is a smaller version of this, okay? Or it could be maybe half a sphere, like a mushroom cap. Like a mushroom cap? Yeah. And so that mushroom cap then is, if you switch it sideways, is light on the top and dark underneath. Okay? And this one is light on the top and dark underneath. And within these little areas, you'll see lots of little tiny mushroom caps. And so if we can divide up the tree into those little spaces and shapes, we can understand the light and the shadow a little better. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I hope so. It's just a little more difficult to understand this one than it is the others. But we need a light source to start with, and we'll follow the same one as the tree. Okay. And we'll look at the idea that overall this tree is, we'll put it here so you can see. You see those 2 together? Yeah. Overall, this is going to be a gallery view. Let me go on focus view for you. Okay. How's that?
Yeah, that's good.
Is that better? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So overall, this is going to be dark on the dark side, but not the same amount of dark everywhere. So we'll just look at that really strong dark pattern, and it kind of goes up here, and then it comes down here onto the outside, and then it goes down here. And this is approximately the same shape, but not exactly. And so within that dark pattern, we see it flows through. So we're painting around the lights is what we're doing here initially. Does that make sense? So this little area here is that area, right? And now there's a big light in the middle here that has a little dark on the side of it. So we can put a little dark in here. And I'm leaving the light areas as the paper for the moment.
I understand, yeah.
Okay, good. And then this is like almost like a circle, this big shadow here. So we can put that in. Right, let that come down. And then actually as the light goes towards as the shadows go towards the light side, they get just a little bit lighter too. And so we've got this shape coming up here. We can have another little bit of a light there. There's a shadow coming in here. And basically then it's smaller versions of these little shapes. So it's very much like this idea that we did down here. Very much the same.
It's foliage, kind of.
It's foliage, yes, exactly. So there's a light against a dark on the back here, and then there's a few little lights and darks on the side here. This one has a little shadow on the back side in a couple of places, and just a little bit more shadow in there. And so we're fracturing it to bring it into something that we can make a little bit more sense out of. And this one here is just a little bit more round than I've made it. So,
and you're using an 8 brush?
I'm using an 8 brush, yes.
Okay.
And so we're trying to just understand the shapes when we do this. And what we'll find is that these shapes on the back side are actually shadowed just a little bit more. And so we pull in just a little bit more shadow on the back side there. I'm just using my damp brush to do this, to connect things up a bit. Can you see? And these areas are connected just a little bit more. So we'll use the damp brush for that. As they come across, this one's just connected a bit more. This one has just a little bit more shadow that's connected. And there's a couple more little areas here that are shadowed. So what we look for is we don't need quite such hard edges basically within the tree. Once we start to soften the edges and link things together a little bit, we get a bit more feel for how that pattern works. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it looks it looks very dimensional, right? I can clearly see some dark spots, some sort of medium
tones, right? Exactly.
And then as it sort of fades into where there's little blotches of white,
right? That would be the lightest tone, and it would never be pure white in a tree like this. It would always have some tone, but we're using the whites just to help us understand where the light areas are. But we can actually link those together just a little bit more to give us a light tone instead of white. And that's more necessary in this type of tree.
Yeah, I see that. That's beautiful.
Okay, so go ahead and do that one. And try and link the darks together whenever you can, because that's always a good thing to do. Particularly through here, we'll have a few little darks linked. And if you can break it up like this into shapes initially in your head, it makes it easier to paint. And as far as making it look like a tree, the very last thing that we do is just to add a few little leaves, dark ones in the dark area and light ones in the light area. And then it begins to look a lot more tree-like.
I think what always throws me off is just, you think about leaves as opposed to, big.
Exactly. And that's what you've got to get your head around. It's not about the leaves, not until the very end. And then you add in just those few leaves make it look much more realistic. Can you see?
Yeah.
Much more realistic. So you can afford to link things together just a little more. And then, of course, the trunk will be the same. The light will be coming from this side. There's actually two little sections to the trunk there. And you can just soften it off to the light side. And the shadow on this little guy, the trunk will come out just a little bit. And then the tree will extend out, but in a flat way, more like that. Depending on whether this is going up or not. I've given the impression that the tree is up on the top of the hill by painting this at an angle. If I wanted the ground to be completely flat, I would have painted it horizontally. But I did this one a little bit differently just so you could see. So it looks like it's going uphill, right? Or it's on the top of the hill. And it's the shadow that does that. And I'll just do a slightly darker tone in the trunk there. Okay, your turn. Okay. See what you can do with that one. Take your time and see if you can figure out the shapes. Don't get too lost in the shapes. And you can push back with your brush to lift out some lighter shapes or to link the shapes together. And most of it's going to be just a little bit lighter overall on the light side. So everything's going to be just a bit lighter on the light side. The shadows are a bit lighter, the shapes are, so that you have that feeling of dark on the shadow side coming down here. And it'll be easier when we do this, a little bit easier when we do this in color, because you'll be able to see the different colors of those shapes.
And it's hard, I think, to remember that it dries lighter.
Yes, of course. Yeah, that's watercolor.
Right.
That's the joy of watercolor. So usually because of that, we work in light tones to middle tones to dark tones, and then we can make that transition easier. And so when you do it in color, it's easier. Sometimes I'll do these studies on toned paper, even for watercolor, because it works well. And we'll do a couple of those as webinars too, I think, because translating color is always a challenge.
Yeah, and I'm just realizing now as I'm looking at it, I probably could have made the trunk a little bit shorter. Yes. And then the tree a little bit wider.
Yes. Yep.
Right. That would give it more like what it really is in real life.
So one way to do that is to measure the tree this way with your pencil and this way and see the difference. And pretty much if you measure this tree across and you measure the height, it's just a little wider than it is tall. Okay, so I use my pencil for that to figure out, how wide it is in relation to how tall it is. And it's just a little wider. So when you do the initial drawing, that part will happen.
That'll happen. Okay.
Yes. Hard because you're learning so many things at once. So learning all about how to paint, how to draw, and then if you have any holes for the birds to fly through, you can add a few branches in there ultimately.
And I think too, at least for me, I know sometimes too, I still have the using too much water as an issue.
That's a given for everybody who starts painting in watercolor. It's a given. It's very difficult to know, and if you can use the tape around your paintings or even next to your painting, so if you're doing something like this, you can put the tape next to it like that, And that gives you a guide. And this just says it's a light middle tone. So then you know it's really hard on white paper to know how dark or how light everything should be. It's very difficult. It takes a lot of practice to get to the point where you can jump in right away with the right tone. Okay, one more tree to go. Are you good with that one? Can I see how you finish that one off? Did you add just a little bit more?
I did add more, but I think it's too wet.
Okay, yes, it is a little bit too wet. So once it's dried a bit, you can go back in and you can separate out those shapes just a little bit more on the shadow side.
Yeah.
And that will work. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So the eucalyptus now has flowing, here's a eucalyptus right here. It has foliage that sometimes flows down a little bit. It goes out and flows down. It has that more of that feeling of flowing down, kind of like the willow tree a little bit. Mm-hmm. So we want it to, sometimes it goes up, but a lot of times these areas are going in this direction. They're coming down. And we want it to be just a little bit lighter. So I'm going to add some water to my paint so the foliage is not too dark. We need a light source. Even if we see a tree like this, where the light is straight on, front on, and it looks flat, we want to add a light source to make it look dimensional. This has a little bit of shadow, so it gives us an idea that the light isn't absolutely flat. It might be coming this way just a little bit, or you can go the other way around and you can have your light on that side. It doesn't matter. You decide, okay, which side you want the light on. It doesn't really matter on this one. I think I'll have it coming from the left here. So that means that this side of each one of these little areas is going to be left light, and underneath each one of these little clumps of foliage is going to be dark. And I've lightened up the paint just a little bit, and even going over to the light side, I'm just going to soften the edges here just a wee bit. Going over to the light side, we'll leave them just a little bit lighter, but they have shadow underneath. So they're going to have a little bit of shadow like that. Can you see what I'm thinking? I'm thinking if the light is catching the top here, then the shadows are going to be underneath those edges.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's getting...
kind of like an umbrella.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And that's the way to think of the oak tree too, if you want to. So I'm separating them out just like we did down here at the top there, those little areas of foliage, and just a little bit more shadow on the shadow side. So we know that that's the shadow side. Mm-hmm. And then it starts to look a bit more dimensional. We'll soften the edges here in and out of that foliage. And there'll probably be just a little bit of shadow in there that will flow over. And then on this tree, we now have some branches that are inside, so we can paint those. And some of them would have some light and some of them would be in shadow. The ones on the light side probably would have just a little bit more light. This one probably would be in shadow. And the shadow side of the trunk will be on this side. Okay, and we'll just soften that off so that it goes around the tree. And it's always a good idea to finish the tree off in a different way on each side. So this one is a little longer, that one's just a little bit shorter. That making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, a little bit more dark there. And then the shadow for this one would go off in this direction. And we've got that in the way, so we won't do too much of that. So I'm just adding a touch more tone at the base of each of these while they're still wet, especially on the dark side. So each little clump of foliage, even if it's broken up a little bit, each one has its own light and shadow shape. Okay? All right, your turn for that one.
And do they connect? They don't always necessarily connect, do
No,
they?
no. Sometimes they'll have spaces in between, so they don't always connect. It just depends on the tree. And so they're kind of loose, and then you can have a little bit of foliage, coming out from the edges like I did down here. And that gives you more. All of that is detail at the end, though. You don't need that until you've got the light and shadow. None of that detail is important until you have the light and shadow. Okay.
Okay. On the dark side, the edges are, the part that's dark, it's okay to have like not a soft edge, more crisp.
Yes, it's okay to do that because ultimately you can come back in and you can loosen it up with some leaves.
Okay.
Which is what you see with these trees usually. And it's exactly the same as we did with the oak, where we came back in and loosened it up with some leaves along the edge there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to lift this out just a wee bit more before we go back. Could have left that white. Yes, the last class I left that white. But somehow it seems a little more fractured in the oak tree when you leave it white, because oaks are a darker tree overall. It feels as though you have just a little more shape if you don't leave it white, if you connect things together a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so go ahead and do that one. And then we're going to move on to a little bit of color.
Okay. So the shadow of this one doesn't necessarily have the little clump.
Well, the shadow is basically the trunk until about here, and then it would run into the same idea.
And it would be.
But I didn't do it because of what I've got down here on the page.
I think I made my shadow too fat, but I get it.
You can just give that a little bit of tone on the top there if you want to. And the same with the oak tree.
Okay.
All right, so we've been sitting here for about an hour. Let's take a little break so you can get up and move around, all right? And we'll come back in 5 minutes, and we'll do these in color.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Sounds good.
And so what we're going to do now is we're going to take some of those tonal studies and we're going to translate them into color. And on your sheet here, your helpful sheet here, it tells you some tree varieties, and there's the other sheet that talks a little bit about painting trees. And so the colors that you can use are basic colors from the palette, the ones that we've used for all sorts of subjects. If you want a warm green, you're going to start with a warm yellow. If you want a cool green, you're going to start with a cool yellow, always. Blue greens have a little bit more Prussian blue in them. Yellow greens have a little more yellow in them. And the mixtures are written here, but we'll go through a couple of those for the oaks as we go.
Okay.
Something like the eucalyptus will sometimes be a gray green. And so a gray green, I use ultramarine blue and Hansa yellow and a little raw sienna for that. An olive green is Prussian blue and cadmium yellow and burnt sienna. And you have all of those mixtures, and those are the ones that you're going to use for your greens chart so that you know how to make those anytime you want to, okay?
Okay.
So we want a relatively warm green for this, do you think?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll start with cadmium yellow. Let's go over to the palette. And we'll see if we can keep all of that close so you can kind of see where we're going with that. All right, so this is my gray mix, and we'll just clean out this little space to make a light version of that green. So always start with the yellow and then add the blue. Otherwise, you'll waste a lot of paint. So a warm, bright green says cadmium yellow, Prussian blue. Okay, a little bit of Prussian blue, just a tiny touch of Prussian blue. And that will give us our light, warm green. Sort of oaky green, isn't it? Okay. Now, if you want that green to be a little less bright, a little more muted like oak colors are, you can add in just a touch of burnt sienna. And that will make it more of an oaky color. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah. So it mutes it down. It makes it warmer. And then you can test that on your paper and see how you like that. Let's just set on the back of this one. And that feels like an oaky color on the light side. All right. And now we want a middle tone version of that, which will be the same colors, but more paint and less water. A little bit more of the blue to make it darker, so it's more of a middle tone. And then we're going to warm it up with the burnt sienna. Also darkens it down a bit. Okay, we need to go just a little darker on that. There we go. So we've got all three colors in there. And now we have a middle tone version of that. Okay? All right, and now on the other side of my palette here, I'm going to make a dark version because we need all three tones to be able to paint, light, middle tone, and dark. Start with yellow. Usually the darks are smaller areas. In this tree, they're actually a little bigger, and a little bit of a lot more Prussian blue. So we want to make a dark green to start with, and then we'll warm it up and darken it a bit more with burnt sienna. So there's our dark green. Now we'll add in some burnt sienna to darken it down. You okay with that?
Yeah.
All right, and then we've got our dark green. Okay, just a little cooler, and oftentimes the shadows are a little cooler. And we might even need to go darker than that in a few places. We can have the darkest dark over here with just a little blue and burnt sienna and just a touch of yellow for a really strong dark in a few places if we need it. Just a few touches. You can see in my tree here there's a stronger, really strong dark in a few places. Okay, and that can have a bit more burnt sienna, and that will give it a darker dark. So as you get towards the darks, you use more paint and less water. Okay, so we'll take the same light source that we used before, and this one has slightly harder edges so you can see it just a little bit easier. And we'll try to see if we can match the pattern that we've got in our tone. So we've got light tones on the side here, right? Really light tones here. So we'll put those in. And they go across the front of this, they go across the front of that. There's a little bit of a light tone coming across here that feels a bit warmer. And there's a lighter tone back here. And pretty much all the front of this is light. And so front edges of all of these areas are light. So we'll just add in some of those light tones. It's just a little too solid up there. Just loosen it up a bit. There we go. That's better. A little bit freer. And as soon as I've done that, I'm going to start to add in some middle tones behind them to break them up just a little bit. So the middle tones go right next, and they can bleed into the light tones. They go right next to the light tones. Come back and add a few more little lights in here. Maybe another little light in there. There we go. So we're beginning to get a feel for how these tones work. Now we're on to middle tones down here, and we can go directly into dark tones at the back of the tree because most of that is dark. And so we'll go with the darker tones back there. It's just a little too cool, so I'm going to add a bit more burnt sienna to that mix to warm it up a bit. As I put it on the paper, it feels too cool. So this is the dark tone, so I've just added a little burnt sienna to warm it up a little bit. There we go. Can you see how it looks too blue? So we'll just add a little, there we go. Now we're better. All right, I'll spread that out just a little bit more with my water. And these are the shapes that we're seeing, those dark shapes that we saw originally that are coming in here and under here a little bit, going up through there and in this little area too, down here. And as they go towards the front, these little dark shapes get lighter and just a bit smaller. Trying to keep it really blocky to start with so you can see, not linking everything together yet. Doing okay with that?
Yeah. I just realized, I think in some of my paint is a little bit too watery, but I'm getting what you're doing there.
Okay, good. Good. Well, let's make sure we have enough middle tone in here now to link these together on the center, in the center of the tree. You can soften a few edges now to make those tones just a little bit softer, so they're not too sharp, and they start to link together a bit more when you do that. A bit more dark in there to separate that one out. A little bit more dark down here. And this side of the tree actually goes out just a bit more. We can make that happen too, if you want to. You don't have to, but if you want to, you can. So back up here, there's not too much light. In this area, this comes over just a little bit more. So you can adjust the tones just a little bit by lifting back some of that color that you've put in. See that? So you can get your shapes back if you lose them. And maybe just a touch more of the dark up here on this side. Just a little bit up there. So the light side's pretty light all the way across. It doesn't really have too much in the way of strong darks. And I'm kind of softening it all down so that it connects together. And you can see those clumps. And then we'll come back in and we'll put some darks in between those in a moment, some strong darks. And oftentimes there's stuff hanging down from these trees, so we can do a little bit of that if you want to too. And while that's drying down, I'm going to make the dark brown for the trunk with ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Nice dark brown. And we'll put that trunk color in. Actually two little trunks there, so we can add in another little one. And then we can soften that edge down so it rolls, that color rolls over to the light side just a little bit. You okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm just waiting for it to dry because like I said, in some places I think I have the there's too much water in my paint color, so
Yes.
in some places it bled a little bit, but
Okay.
I see where I have shapes, and so like I need to add dark in certain places to make that shape pop out a little more.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to do with that final little dark in a moment. We're going to make that happen. While you're waiting, you could put a little grass on the ground using the light green, just to give an idea. And then the shadow in this one, when we do this, the shadow is going to be a darker version of the green, okay?
Oh, okay.
And that's how that works. Make it just a little taller so it goes behind the tree a little bit. And then we'll have space for the shadow in there.
I actually like it. I'm getting the shape part.
Good, excellent. That's really what this is about. This is to help you understand, because these trees are particularly difficult to paint. And so anything that you can do to help certainly works. So at this point, you've got the choice of lifting out a few things and softening a few things and darkening a few things, and, you know, if you need to. While that's drying, you can do that. So I'll just take out a little bit there. And then I'm going to come back in with that very strong dark that I made in a moment when it's dry. Now there's another color that you can use for oaks too that we don't have on the beginning palette, but I have it on the intermediate palette, and that's quinacridone gold, and that makes really nice warm olive green colors. So if you have that, you can try that for your oaks again another time. That, and also for the eucalyptus, that would work nicely too. Okay, so now I'm going to look at the tree very carefully, and I'm going to see where the darkest darks are, the little tiny darkest darks. And I'm going to put just a little bit of that really dark color where I see the darkest dark areas. In here, I see a little bit, so I'm looking at that shape coming in around here, and just a little bit more at the top there. This is the really strong dark. And it's just a touch in the middle there. And then it kind of comes down behind this area down here. It's really quite dark on the back side of this. I've got an extra little bump in there, but that's okay. Extra little shape. And this darkest dark shouldn't go too far towards the front, okay? It should stay in the center of the tree and away from the light side. You don't want too much of this anywhere near the light side.
So you're using the dark then to give more definition to those little clusters.
You got it, yes. And I'm going to come in with a little bit more middle tone to link together to make that work a little better so that the tones are not quite so separate. Mm-hmm. Everything links together just a little bit more, and we tighten it up a bit by connecting the middle tones to the darks. A little bit more middle tone in here, and then we'll see what we're doing there and see how we're doing. This one is mostly middle tone. And a little bit more middle tone in there. Beginning to get the idea now?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. And then we talked about the idea of warm and cool, and right now this is all feeling pretty cool as far as the greens go. So you can add in just a touch of burnt sienna. On a lighter tree you could use raw sienna. And this could just be a little glaze or a little touch of color, not too strong. So it's going to be about this sort of tone.
That's pretty.
And we can just pop that in a few places. Now the place to pop it in is between the light and the shadow is a good place to add in these little touches of warms. So on the light side, I'll use raw sienna, just to show you how that works. A little bit of raw sienna in there. And it warms up that tree quite nicely. And then you can just adjust the shapes if you need to. But that extra dark makes a big difference. That really strong dark in a tree like this makes a very big difference.
Yeah, I see that. It really makes those, like from where I'm looking at the top sort of right side, you can tell that there's light, that's the light side.
Right. Yeah.
And then sort of in the middle, there's like these four little clusters
right.
of light surrounded by
dark.
The dark
yes,
part,
exactly.
You know?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, and you can have as many little clusters as you need for the tree. I'm simplifying it down just a little bit. So technically there's another one down here that we can pull out a bit more, but it doesn't really have to be. But ultimately, these darks are pretty dark in the tree, and you need that dark shadow to make the tree look dimensional. So, and then the last thing that you would do is on the dark side, you would use a middle tone or a dark to drop down some of these leaves, okay, and pop out some leaves on the edges to make it look a little bit more leaf-like. Okay, this is going to add to the dimension of the tree, and on the light side, you'd use the light color for that. So you'd pull out the leaves over here with the lighter tone. And up here too, you can just pull that out and get more of a feeling of that tree.
Yeah, that looks really lovely.
Sometimes you have to go back and darken the trunk a little bit if it dries too light. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to do is to add in the shadow. And the shadow could be the middle tone because you use the light green for the grass, and so you could use the middle tone for the shadow. And that shadow is going to come across here. That might need to be just a touch darker. So there we go, just a little touch. And it's going to follow the ground. Okay, so it's going to come out like that and disappear off in that direction. But the shadow is usually going to be a darker version of the ground color.
Okay.
And if you did have any areas where you can see the birds flying through, any holes, now would be a good time to put trunks or branches in those areas. Yeah, branches. I'm just going to put just a little bit more of the foliage out here on the side. Just because of the shape, I think it might be a good idea to do that. So this is generally what happens in a tree, and we can lose a few of those soft edges that I've got just by putting in a few little darks so that they become more tree-like. Those little shapes become more tree-like. So I've broken up a little bit this shape. Instead of having a soft edge like this, right?
Right.
I've added in some marks, some paint marks to make the edge just a little bit more like a variation of leaves in there.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I waited until it was dry to do it on this one. But really this is a bit too wet to work with right now. But the idea is that each little area of foliage is full of leaves, and so those leaves don't have soft edges like this. So you could use the hairdryer to dry it down just a bit. Let's see if this one needs to be. And then we can put a few more of those in. So the edgy things that I'm talking about are little edges of leaves in these areas. And so they can be middle tones or darks, and they're just a little bit more of a sharp edge instead of the soft edge that we had there before. Okay?
Yeah, so on the light side, we don't really need a lot of, so on the light side, it's more the light and the mid-tone.
Exactly. And the
And then on
dark,
the dark side, it's more the dark and the mid-tone.
you got it, yeah.
And then it seems like the center of the tree is a little bit of everything, but mostly the dark, which is defining it.
Yeah, the dark defines the middle tones. And so I'm lifting out a little bit so as you're talking so you can see this. So you can see just a little bit more of a mid-tone if I lift out those areas there within that shadow area of the tree. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah. And so, yes, you've got the right idea that, yes, you don't need as many darks as you move towards the light side. And as the darks go towards the light side, they get just a little bit lighter as they go towards the light side.
And when you add the little leaves around the edge, it's
you have to use the same tone that you used in the first place. So if it's the light side, you use the light paint. If it's dark, you use the dark paint. If it's middle tone, you use the middle tone paint.
Okay. And again, those are just little marks.
Just little dots, because they give the impression of leaves, and that's all you need. It's really about the big shapes within the tree that you're concerned about in this type of tree. And those shapes can be varied, and I've simplified them down into a few large shapes. Generally, there'll be a few more than just a few large shapes. So here I've opened it up just a bit more and given you a few more shapes. Can you see that? And so you can always go back and do that if you want to, like this, and just have a few more shapes within that space that give a bit more dimension. And then you just lose those soft edges by adding in a few little leaf edges along the way. Right?
Well, I think a couple things I've learned for myself, is just the amount of water.
Yes.
And the different tones, the different tonal colors.
Good. Yeah.
And I can see where in some places the little leaves look just kind of like blobs because I got a little carried away with adding.
And then go ahead.
And having the patience to let it dry.
Yes. Yeah, that's always the key. Yeah, and a little bit of brown in a few places, especially in the middle tones, where the middle tones meet the lights, adds a little life to the tree. See, when you drop in a little burnt sienna, you get more life in the color. And so that's a good place to put that, is between the light and the dark, kind of on the edge there of the middle tones. Raw sienna on this side and burnt sienna in the darker part of the tree.
Yeah, I like that.
And then if you let it dry down, you can always come back and tighten up a few little edges once it's dry. So you have a choice and the way that we're varying it and making it look more real is just by exploring those little shapes and making them pop out a bit more or not. And I'm just going through that and doing it over and over again so you could get the idea of how that works. Yeah. And if you can do it in the first shot, without having to do all those little ones, as you get more used to this type of tree, you'll be able to do that. You should be able to get there a little quicker and not have to worry. But I want to make sure you understand how this works and what we're doing and why.
Yeah, I think it's, for learning, I think this is a good exercise. There's a lot.
There's a lot to know, yes.
Take away from this particular
subject.
And starting with the tonal value, and now painting the color part really helps understand just the light, the mid, the dark, and how you decide which version, light, middle, or dark goes where, depending on the light source and how you want it to look.
It sounds like you've got it all. So it sounds like you've really understood that. So now it's just a case of practicing everything over and over again to get it the way you want it to be. And so I'll just lighten up this a little bit, and then I'm going to stop on this one. And I might just go back in and add a few little sharper edges when that dries, but it's looking pretty much okay at the moment. We'll not worry too much about that. And so you've got the idea of that one. So now what you're going to do is you're going to make that chart, and then you're going to come back and paint these trees in, the rest of these trees in color to match your tonal value. Right? Same thing. So let's just see if we can do the eucalyptus tree before we finish, because that's the most difficult one again, that you'll have trouble with. And maybe I'll do it on this one, because I'll let that one dry down a bit. I'll do it on this page. So here's our eucalyptus tree. We've got it at the top here. We can see it in the middle. We just fold that.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So you can see that. Okay. And that just gives us an idea of the light. It's an evening light, and so the fronds, the areas of foliage are going to be just a little bit warmer overall. But basically, for a eucalyptus tree, we're going to use more of a grade green. So I'm just going to clean up my palette so we can start. And when you're out walking, do take a look at the colors that you see in the leaves and in the bushes, and take some photographs. I suggested that everybody take photographs before the next lesson of foliage that you see in your neighborhood, preferably with a good light source. So that means you have to go out in the morning or in the evening, not in the middle of the day.
Okay.
And that way you'll get a good light source. And then you'll have those to refer to for light and shadow when you paint a little bit more along the way in this class. Okay, so let's go back to the palette. And let's take a look and see if we can make more of a grade green. I'll just pull that out a bit so you can see the whole palette.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so going back to the Painting Trees handout, to make a grade green, we're going to use ultramarine blue and Hansa yellow. And of course I started with the blue. You really should start with the yellow because you don't need quite as much blue as yellow. And that's going to give you a grayish green. It's fairly bright. We're going to add a little raw sienna into that just to calm it down a bit. We're going to look at that on the paper and see how it looks. Can you see that? If you want it a little grayer, you can add just a bit more blue.
Okay.
All right. So that's kind of the color that you're seeing with eucalyptus. It depends on the eucalyptus, but effectively it's more of a grade green than a warm green like the oak. More along this idea. So we can use this and just a touch of the warmer tones to give this warm look, if you want to, that you see in the photograph. And that would be a touch of burnt sienna and a touch of raw sienna separately. And that way you'll get more of that color that you're seeing in the evening when the sun goes down and the light's on the tree.
Okay.
But we're going to use this as our base, this gray color. So we'll come back and we'll do exactly what we did with the same light source. So exactly what we did with the tone. And we'll say we need a little bit of light tone on this side. We're not going to leave any pure whites on this. We're going to make everything fairly light on the light side. So I'm using that light grade green to start with just a touch more water in it. Okay, over here I just put a little bit more water in it. on the side of the palette here.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes a really light version of green for the light side. Okay. And then I'm going to take the regular green, and that's going to be a kind of a middle tone. And we'll just add that in towards the shadow side. Looking at the areas where we put tone on this, so we can compare. A little bit more tone up there. And on this side, just a bit more tone. Underneath these guys, just a little bit more. So we're getting that feeling of the foliage and how it flows down. And we can pull it down just a little bit in a few places to make that work a little better, because it's kind of that droopy feel within the tree too. There's a middle tone in here. So that's really just the light tone with just extra light, extra water on the side. And now the middle tone of that, I'm going to add a little burnt sienna too, just to make sure it's not too bright. Yes, there we go. And we'll add just a little bit of that in here. While it's still wet, it can bleed in. That's okay. Basically, that goes on the shadow, in the shadow areas. So it's on the bottom of all of these little areas.
So you just added burnt sienna to make that.
To make that just a little bit more of a
darker green.
Yes, yes.
Okay. That's right.
And here I haven't broken it up quite as much as I did in the other drawing, but we could have just a little bit more light on there if you want to break this up just a little bit more. And what you have to do is when you're outside, if you squint, quite often you can see the light and shadow a little bit more clearly. If you squint at the tree, it helps. And of course, those little, leafy type edges can happen at any time. We can add those in. So we get more of that loose edge feel on the eucalyptus. On the light side too. A little bit up here as well, just a touch of that leafy feel. Just going to make this one just a bit darker, pull it out a bit. And I've left a few holes for the birds to fly through in this one. And for the branches. And sometimes the eucalyptus stem trunk is light and sometimes it's dark. It depends on the eucalyptus, but we could make this one fairly light. It would be a light gray tone. So that would be ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Grayish brown, be fine for that. So then we can go in and paint this trunk, a shadow on the back side, and the branches that you can see through the gaps. and just soften off that edge so it rolls over into the trunk. I usually like to paint those branches in while the paint is still just a little wet too, because that way they bleed a little bit and they look more interesting. Okay, I'll put a tiny bit more of that middle tone in now it's dried a bit, just to separate out a few of those areas. And if you want to make it warmer now, you can use a little raw sienna, just a few touches on the light side, just to warm it up a little bit.
Oh, I like that. That's nice.
That gives it a little more interest. Nature always gives us warm and cool together, and so we want to make sure that we see that. And we might need just a slightly darker green in the center here. And I'm just going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to my cooler green here, to my middle tone green, to get that darker tone. It's just a little bit too warm. Now it's too cool. There we go. That should do it. So don't really need anything too dark in here, because it's a fairly open tree, but we need to know where the light side is and the shadow side is, and where the little areas of shadow and light are. So I'm just adding in mostly on the shadow side, just a bit of that dark. In the center of the tree where it's shadowed a bit more, and up here where it's shadowed just a little bit more in the center. And that should do it for this. You can use a little bit of light green for the grass. And if you were going to paint this with a sky, you'd always paint the sky first before you paint the tree. So.
And you would see the sky underneath the tree in those little
Yes, okay. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. And so the handout that I sent you had, the color handout that I sent you had those trees painted with a little bit of color. And a little bit of the feeling of the place. Okay, so you can yeah. And then the other thing that we're going to do, and that we didn't do on our first one, actually, we didn't include that one. I guess I must have missed that one out. Are the birch trees. So we'll put those in just before we finish today. Okay. So those should be in tone as well, and you can see them on this one. What we did was to make a darker tone in the background. And for some reason, I didn't put them on this sheet, so we'll make sure we do those on this one. So you can see how that goes. So I'm just going to put a little bit of a dark tone here and take that slightly darker green out for the shadow, and then it's going to disappear off into that area. I'm just going to take slightly darker tone down the back side of the trunk. Soften it off just a bit more. There we go. Now, sometimes you'll see the tall trunk, and sometimes those branches will come lower down, and so you can extend them down if you want to. That's entirely up to you. We'll leave this one a little taller, that's fine. And let's see if we can make each side here a little different height. And it looks more interesting usually if you have one side of the tree looking a little different than the other side of the tree. So we'll do it that way. And we'll just add a little bit more light here. Okay, I think we're pretty close on that one.
So looking at that, like the oak tree, the difference there is that the clumps have a little more sort of light in between them, I guess.
Yes, they do. It's more of an open tree, and when you look at the tree itself, quite often you see the sky between the shapes, particularly towards the top of the tree. And that will happen more towards the top of the tree in pretty much all of the trees. It will open up just a little bit more. The oaks tend to not have quite as much of that. Sometimes they'll have it at the edge, but our oaks here tend to be a little more solid. Okay?
Okay.
So yes, you will see that in different varieties of trees. Okay?
Okay.
All right. So you have your light and shadow here on this one. All right? So we can make that happen in color on this one. So you can do this one at home by yourself because that's not too difficult. What you're doing is you're painting in between the branches, the trunks,
right,
with dark tones, little bushes maybe in the background and something not quite so dark here, and then a little shadow on the side of the trunk on each side here, and the marks. So let's do it in color, and it'll be the same idea. And you can decide whether you want maybe a greenish tone back here or maybe a fall tone. It's up to you. Okay. I'll do a darker greenish, cool greenish tone back there. So we have that idea. All right, I'm going to use a little ultramarine blue and Hansa yellow for that, with a touch of burnt sienna, just to calm it down a bit. And it's going to be a darkish tone. So it's going to look like this. Okay, just a neutral dark green. All right. So looking at the birch trees, the idea is that the birch trees are white, and so they look better if they have a dark tone behind them. So this little dark tone, this is negative painting, where we're not painting the trees, we're painting what's behind the trees. I'm going to leave those bushes on this one just a little bit lighter. So I'll leave a space down there for some lighter bushes. I'll take this way up to the top. Okay. And the color doesn't really matter here. It's just so long as it's a darker tone, it doesn't matter. And there are two trees together there, so we'll separate those out. And these little guys are very thin, and quite often they'll be darker anyway. But we'll just leave them a little bit lighter on this one.
So we're just painting around the trunks.
We're just painting around the trunks and leaving a little loose edge at the bottom here that we could add in some lighter bushes at the end. Okay, so that's what you need to do to start with. This is a very quick little study. Usually when you have a white trunk tree, you're going to want to have a dark background to pop it out. Did you take the birch tree lesson, video lesson?
I did.
Yeah, same idea, basically. But we don't need to use the Frisket, the liquid latex. This is small enough not to need to do that. Okay. So this could be grasses down here. We could use that light green tone that we've got already on the palette, or something similar, to put in some little grassy type bushes in here. So these trees now look as though they're in the background. They're further back. And these trees just a little bit further forward.
Okay.
Okay, good. All right, now between these two trees, we're going to separate them. We have a light source. Our light source will come from this direction, okay, which means that this side of the tree is light, this side is dark, this is light, this is dark, okay. So we're going to need a little shadow, a gray shadow. Ultramarine blue and burnt sienna is fine for that. And we put a little shadow on the back side of each of these trees and then soften it down with a damp brush. Okay. And if you remember, we used a little warm tone in the center of these when we're doing a lot of these and when they're close up. But for but for this one, it's not really necessary. If you wanted to add that warm tone, then you just put a touch of burnt sienna along the edge of that shadow. And that would warm that edge up a bit. And that just brings everything forward a bit more. You can try and put some tiny shadows on the little trees. It's going to be a bit more difficult because they're very thin. You don't really have to soften them off. You can just leave them. But they just need to have a touch of dimension. And so this is the dimension that we get when we're painting these trees, right? It's really about the shape of the tree, so it's about the shadow. And the shadow could be just a touch darker on this one, and just a touch darker on that one. There we go. So then they start to look dimensional. As soon as we start to add light and shadow to anything, we get the three-dimensional look. Okay, and now we can decide which colors, probably a dark gray is a good color for the markings on the tree. Again, it's burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. Make it into a brownish, dark brown color would be good. And for these trees, I'm going to use a number 6 brush because they're so small. And I'm just going to put in a few little marks that read like birch trees. Okay, just on these guys. You don't need them on the back. As soon as you put these marks in, they look like birch trees. And on the big ones, let's just make sure that shadow's not too wet. We'll connect them with a little bit of the idea of branches going out like that. Okay. And we'll make the markings just a bit bigger and a little bit more varied. And sometimes there'll be a branch coming down this way. So just a little variety of branches going in different directions on these. And a few branches on the back of these trees too. The little ones back here, really we need a smaller brush because their branches are too big for this. But I think you've got the idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see now. I needed to make my background a little bit darker there.
Okay.
But I get it.
You get it. Good. Well, I'm hoping that you'll have time over this 3 weeks to this class to be able to paint a lot of trees, and you'll be by the end of the class you'll be much more comfortable with how all of this works.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're going to do now is at home is you're going to use this as a guide, or other pictures if you like. If you have your own pictures, that's fine. And you're going to try and paint a few of these. Take the idea of the cypress for these guys. Okay, this cypress tree here, because it's very similar to a redwood. For this idea, or this cypress down here, if you like, you could use some of those shapes, right, to make that more interesting. And for here, palm trees, I think I sent you some suggestions of the colors for all of the different trees in the email. And so you can look for the colors for all of these different trees to work there. Okay?
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. I feel like I've learned so much today.
Good. And please do one of these, all right? If you want to take a screenshot of this before I take it away, do one of these in tone, all right, next to your eucalyptus before you do the color one. And I just flipped the background colors on this one. I made this darker and this lighter. Either way would be fine. Okay?
It'll work. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this.
Great. Good. Okay, keep painting, and I'll see you again soon.
Okay, thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye, Trisha.
Okay, bye now. So, welcome back to Trees this afternoon. And this afternoon I'm going to continue working on the page of color trees to relate them to the tone. So we're going to translate the tonal values into color on the rest of this page so that you can see how that works. I started already by doing a little bit of work on the palm trees. I'll go in a bit closer and show you how that works. Palm trees are usually cool, so we're going to use Hansa yellow to start with, and a little ultramarine blue to make that cool tone. And you can see that over here on the palette, if I pull that a little closer. That's a good tone for the leaf area. And palm trees also have a lot of other colors in them. So raw sienna is a good tone to use too. Let me make that a little cleaner. There we go. A little bit of raw sienna there. And a little burnt sienna too. And then for the trunks of the palm trees, you're going to need gray. And gray is ultramarine blue and burnt sienna always. Okay, that's a brown. We'll take a little bit more blue in there and make it into a blue-gray or a grayish tone. That'll work just nicely. Okay, so I started already by putting in a little color onto these trees, and you can see how I painted the tree with the shape of the fronds as they come down here. And each time you're going to put a little stroke in to make that frond drop down. And you're going to leave the top of the palm edges light. They can have just a little bit of raw Hansa yellow on them afterwards, or raw sienna. As you work, you're going to drop in just a touch of raw sienna in a few places and a touch of burnt sienna in a few places. In the video area of my site, there is a video showing you how to paint palm trees. So you can take a look at that if you'd like to. And in the center here, just a little brown to make the dark areas. So depending on the type of palm tree, it'll be more of a solid center or a little bit more open. And the trunk is going to be the grayish tone that we talked about, with just a little touch of the darker tone on the right-hand side. The light is coming from the left here. So we'll just put that in just a touch darker on the side here and extend it out into a shadow. And I put just a little raw sienna in here for the sand. You can do that too. So same thing on this one. We'll put it out. And on this one too. And bring one of those fronds across the front here. And this one just to change it up a little bit. Give it a slightly different shape. Good idea if these are feeling as though they're blowing in the wind a bit. So I'm using a number 6 brush for this because it's a tiny, tiny subject. But it's a good idea to figure this stuff out on a small scale before you go into the larger painting. And the shadow can come out, and the shadow follows the shape of the sand and also extends the shape of the subject and gives us a light source, gives us a feeling of light. So palm trees are not that difficult to paint. You can try that. Provided they have good light and shadow, they're going to work very nicely. Cypress trees and redwood trees over here, after you finish the palm trees, we'll move on to those. Those are more horizontal. So the branches and the foliage that's coming away from the branches is a little more horizontal. Sometimes it's diagonal, but it has that feeling of being stacked. And in all of the palm trees, types of trees that you see like this, the cypress tree as well, the feeling is that everything is stacked in rows, maybe a little diagonally in some places. And this also is a similar idea of the cypress tree. And so we want to make sure that we get the light on the top of these areas and the shadow underneath. So here's a tonal study of one of these little trees that we did just a few days ago. And doing the tonal study first helps you to see the shapes, figure out the shapes. And this is the iconic palm tree that's on Highway 17 in California. It's been there for many, many years. I'm not sure it's quite the shape anymore, but it was that shape for many years. And so then we have light on the top of each of these areas and dark underneath and dark in the center. And that gives us that feeling of light coming from above or coming from this direction. The rock that it's sitting on will have a shadow on the backside, if that's the case. Okay. Also, the trunks on these trees are more interesting. The trunks on redwoods are going to be pretty straight up, but the trunks on cypress trees are going to be a little more angled, a little more interesting to look at. So overall, they're cool in color. So we're still staying with this idea of ultramarine blue and Hansa yellow for the cooler tones, with a little burnt sienna dropped in to soften it down a bit and make it a little less intense, okay, a little less bright. So this is more along the lines of the color that we see in these trees. It's a little cooler tone like that. Sometimes just a little bit bluer even. A little bit more blue in there. Depending on the tree, sometimes it will be just a little more blue or a little bit more even of turquoise blue. So I'm going to use this as the dark, and on the top I'm going to have a little bit more yellow, and we'll let those two mix together a bit along the way. Quite often the cypress trees can look white on the top if the light is really strong. So let's just take a few of these ideas of the shapes that could be in this tree, extend them out just a little bit so they feel a little bit more tree-like. Leave some spaces for the light, putting in the dark first in this one. Sometimes it's easier to do it that way. Okay, a little bit more up here, and possibly up there too. So we're looking at that feeling of stacked foliage that goes in different directions. It'll have little edges. I didn't draw all of those in, but you can extend that out a bit. So it kind of feels like it's sitting on a flat plane. Let's just extend one over there too. And now a light version of that, if the light is coming from usually above. If these are in a woodsy area, generally the light's coming from above. And so the tops of the trees are going to be lighter. We can put in just a little bit of that Hansa yellow and link it together with the dark so it's not quite so bright. Can be just a touch more blue in there. I think it's just a wee bit too yellow. Maybe a touch more. Need to have it light, pretty light, but not too yellow. There we go, that's better. And just a bit of that happening over there too. So we have that idea of things feeling as though they're stacked. And just like all of the other trees that you paint, you're going to paint this with the foliage first and worry about the trunks as they fit into the foliage afterwards. And the trunks on these guys are going to be a red-brown. So it'll be quite a lot of burnt sienna together with ultramarine blue. And we'll end up with something along the lines of this. Now, quite often you won't see too much light and shadow on the trunks in the foliage areas. Just bring those trunks down and connect them between. It doesn't matter if the paint spreads out a little bit and connects with the foliage, that won't hurt. But maybe down at the bottom here, you might see a little bit of light on one side of the trunk as the light filters through the forest. So it's a good idea to really know the subjects that you're painting. Very good idea to know them. I'm just going to use my damp brush to pull this out to make a slightly lighter side there and a darker side on that side. There we go. Same thing here. Just pull the brush out just to make a lighter edge on that side. And if necessary, go back and darken the back side just a little bit. Good idea to do that while it's still wet. And that way it will bleed across and work nicely. Let's just straighten that up a bit. And these trunks tend to hit the ground, and they go into the ground pretty straight at the bottom there. They don't change too much, angle out too much at the bottom. And a little bit more trunk in there. And of course there would be a shadow underneath these because they're casting a shadow onto the ground. If the light is filtering through, you'll probably see that little blue-grey shadow going across here. And it'll be open in a few places if the light is coming through. So you might see a shadow pattern that looks a little bit more like that. And you may see some connecting foliage going across here in a few places. And you may see a few branches connecting from these big trunks into that area. So you can add a few of those. Generally, the branches are pretty high up in these trees. You tend to see a lot of trunk like this, and occasionally it comes out a little bit, but more often than not it's pretty straight as it hits the ground. We'll have this one come out just a little bit and leave the others straight. So that gives you an idea of what a cypress tree might do, or a redwood tree. They're very similar in their connections and in their structure of foliage. Okay, just a little bit darker there underneath the edges. All right, so in this case, it's a forest tree, so we're seeing maybe smaller areas of this foliage. In this case, it's out in the open, and so the silhouette is much more important. So just watch for that. Okay, now we're going to play a little bit with the pine trees. Pine trees are usually very cool. We could use Prussian blue for this with a little bit of Hansa yellow to make it work well. They vary. Some of them are a little warmer. They vary in shape. They vary in size. These are cypress trees. These are fir trees. Sometimes the foliage is going up like this. Sometimes the foliage is almost vertical. Sometimes it goes down. It just depends on the tree. Okay, so we've got a couple here. We'll do this one with the foliage going up and this one more like a cypress. Okay, but they're pretty cool. So I'm going to take my number 8 brush now and I'm going to just change this mixture here with a little Prussian blue. Don't worry about making correct mixtures the first time. You just want to head in the direction that you want to go for this particular subject. So that's turquoise green, a little bit too bright for the subject. Okay, we'll test it on here. And it's in a good tone, but it's just a little too intense. To take away some of that intensity, we'll add in some burnt sienna. And now we've got something that reads a little bit more like a cypress color, just a little less intense. Burnt sienna is good for that because it takes away the intensity without taking away the color. If you used red, which is the complement, you would lose the color as well. More often than not, it would gray it down a bit too much. I'll put a little bit more yellow back in here. And we'll just see how we go with that. That feels about right. Okay, so we'll use that one for our little trees here. And when we did the tonal study on this, we had the shadow coming from, the light coming from this side. So let's make it the same. And we're going to interpret this as dark on this side and light on this side, but not necessarily white paper. We're going to do a light version of this color on the light side. We're going to put the dark in first, just like we did here, and then we can pull some of that color across. So looking at the side, using a little brush calligraphy, we can paint the edges of this tree, giving it a little interest. And the shadow comes down right underneath. Sometimes those areas will come across the tree just a little bit. And now we can just add a little water to that for the light side and connect that up. So we're matching the pattern of the light and dark that we made in tone. We're matching that as close as we can. Now this is going to need to be a little darker. We'll put a second layer on that afterwards. But in the meantime, I'm just going to use the light tone on the light side of this one. And that'll go in and out of that dark area. And I'm going to use the dark tone on the right-hand side, just like we did. And let them bleed together. It's okay if they bleed together. Just like we did when we did the tone. Okay, now I'm just going to add another little layer of dark in here to darken that down just a wee bit more. Sometimes the shadows on these are pretty strong. And now we have that same idea as we made in tone, but now it's in color. And so this is the best way to work, is to figure it out in tone first, and then add the color. And then you're not working in the dark if you do this, because you have all your information. We can pull out just a little bit of light in here if we've put too much in. Just a little bit too much dark in there, just bled across, so we'll pull that back a bit. But you have all your information with tone, and all you have to do is translate it into color. Just pull this out just a little bit more. It bled in just a bit too much. Just take this damp brush and just pick up the paint, and that will take care of it. And what we're looking for is a light shadow, a light side, relatively light side, and a dark side. And I probably should have waited just a little bit longer before I put that dark in. I'll have to come back and put another little dark on the back side there because it's not quite there yet. But it's close. Okay, so we'll let that sit down and wait and come back to that in a few minutes. This tree is a similar color. It's a bluish green, but it seems to be a little more muted. This one is a brighter green. This one's more of a muted green. So I'm going to add just a bit more of the burnt sienna to this mix. And Hansa yellow. And we'll see if that gives us a tone that's just a little less bright. There we go. A little less bright than the color that we're using here. Okay, for this one. We need a light side and a shadow side. We'll put the shadow side in first, just like we did with the tree that we painted here. And in this case, the light's coming from this side, and so our shadow will be on the left. And we'll give it that idea that it's a bit more open. And so this is the shadow side. We'll come back with the light side afterwards. Shadow side comes across and connects into the light. Just a touch more water in there. And we could open this out just a bit more if you like down here. So it's a little bit freer and looser. Usually at the base of the tree, there's going to be a shadow that goes all the way across from one side to the other. And oftentimes on the light side, there'll be a little shadow underneath these edges, just a bit more of a darker shadow right under the edges. Okay, now we're going to lighten this color up a little bit with some water. And we're going to paint the light side in. Shouldn't be too much lighter, but light enough to be able to see the difference. Oh, we might have to wait just a little bit longer. Let's see if we can make that stay away from the dark. There we go. Now that contrast is just a bit too much right now, so we just have to link the two together just a bit more by bringing some dark across here and bringing some light into this side too. Just link the two together to make that work. So we end up with something that's more like a middle tone in the center. And we'll come back and finish that one off. Also, when it has a chance to dry just a little bit more. Just going to lift out a little bit of color in there. Okay, we can go back to these trees now and add a little more of the blue-green that we were using before. You can make your colors like this. You can keep changing them on your palette. You don't have to keep mixing up new colors every time. The more you mix colors, the easier color mixing will become. And so it's a good idea just to keep mixing over. And here's our dark version of that blue-green, this one. And you'll get very used to how these colors mix very quickly because we don't have too many of them. So now we want to put in the true darks in here. And the true darks go on that side. Okay, just a little bit more of that feeling of strong dark. It's not till you get the strong darks in that things read correctly. This will dry lighter than it looks. And it gives us much more a feeling of separation and a feeling of dimension when we get those darks in. Okay. Now this one will have a shadow too, and we'll use that blue-gray for the shadow. And the shadow for this tree is going to come across here just a little bit, and it's going to be kind of the shape of the tree. And the shadow from this tree is going to be similar, just a little bit further over. So you can actually have two shadows like that for this one. If you're doing a tree that is specifically larger, you can put a tiny bit more detail in it. But it's not so much about detail. It's never about detail in painting. It's always about contrast, light and shadow, and shape. Okay, so detail doesn't give you what you need if you start off with the wrong shapes or you don't have the right tone. You really can't save it with detail. Okay, the detail is there as icing on the cake, but you have to have everything else there first. Okay, for this one, I'll go just a little darker. Same idea, same kind of colors. I just put a little ultramarine in there, a little burnt sienna, and a touch more of the yellow to move that to a darker tone, this slightly warmer green. And now we'll try and follow the pattern that we've got here. So we have a nice little dark pattern on this side with just a few lights showing through. And some of that dark goes across in the center and underneath the edges of this one. One thing I didn't do on the other trees was to give them a trunk. Sometimes you can see the trunks on those, sometimes you can't. We can add just a little bit. I'm just going to make a dark brown here. And I'll put this little trunk in. Again, there won't be a lot of light, but if you were able to see the light, it would be at the base of the trunk like that, and it would be just a little bit lighter like that. And if you were able to see these trunks, they'd be very low down, just connecting with the shadow a little bit. I'm going to pull that one out a bit more, give it a good shape. And now we'll give this a cast shadow. And the light's coming from this direction, so this tree is going to cast a shadow in this direction. First of all, it'll be the shadow of the trunk, just a little bit, and then it'll extend out into, this is just a little bit too blue, it'll extend out into the shadow for the shape of the tree. And you don't have to take it all the way, you can just stop it whenever you want to. It's going to be more like that. Just a single trunk here. Sometimes you might see just a touch of the trunk coming through the center of a tree like this. Very rarely in the cypress, but sometimes in these fir trees you might just see a little trunk area. And if you do, you just paint it in between the foliage, in the areas that may be white or in areas perhaps where the birds could fly through. Yeah, just a little suggestion of trunk in there. It's just a bit too far over. Okay. All right, so what do we have left here now? Yes, we have the bushes that we played with down here. And I think when we did this one, we played with the bushes and they had a little shadow. But we can decide how we want to do the shadow. I'll use the same shadow as this one. So the shadow will be coming, the light will be coming from this direction on these, and the light will be coming from that direction on these. Doesn't matter where the light comes from, as long as you decide and you stay with that decision. That's the important thing. And I'm just looking back at these trees and wondering whether they might need just a little bit more dark, the redwoods. Sometimes that dark dries just a bit lighter than you would like, and you might need to just go back in and revisit just a few touches of slightly darker tones underneath. Okay. All right. Now, so bushes and trees that are connected together work in the same way as all of the trees that we've painted up here. When we put them together, we have to realize that there'll be a light side and a shadow side on each section of the bush, just like there was when we did the tonal value. And the bushes can be any color you like. Let's go for a different color. Let's add a little cadmium yellow to this and have something a little bit warmer for these guys. This will be the light side of the bush, and the shadow side will be a little bit darker. So let's make it a bit more yellow. There we go. So what I'm going to do is paint the light side in on these first, making sure that I don't lose the pencil line so I know where one bush starts and one bush ends. I'm going to put the light side in all the way through, and then I'm going to come back and add the shadow side, connecting with those. Because I really don't want white paper here. It would be unusual to have bushes with white edges. They'd be light, but they wouldn't necessarily be white. Well, that's drying down, and I'm looking again at silhouettes here. Okay, looking at something that feels nice and bushy around the edges. So you change that silhouette if you like and make it more interesting and bushy as opposed to lollipop-like. Okay, we do the same when we come to separate them. Now these guys are fir trees again, so they'll be a little cooler. So we'll take this little puddle here and add in a touch of, I'm going to use ultramarine blue for these trees. And this will be the lightest side of these trees. And we'll put that in everywhere to start with. And then we'll come back and separate them with their shadow sides. And the reason I'm doing this is because when we did the tonal study, we just wanted to understand light and dark. But when we're working in color and dimension, we want a third tone. We want a middle tone. So this is going to be the light, and then there'll be a dark. And between the two, we pull it out a little bit to make that middle tone. Okay, it looks more dimensional when we do that. This is to give you an idea of the light and shadow pattern that's on the tree. Okay, now we need a darker version of the yellow one. So a little more of this, a little more of the Prussian, and a touch of burnt sienna. Will give us a darker yellow-green tone. Okay, something along the lines of that. Okay, that's dry enough now to work with. So if the light's coming from this direction, this is the light side, so the back side of this little bush will be darker. Now let's make sure we understand we're painting not only this edge, but we're also painting into that shape as well. In a moment, I'm going to soften that edge down when it has time to dry just a little bit. This is going to be the light side of this bush, just like this. Okay, and so the dark side is going to be on the back here. This is actually going to be the middle tone of this one, and we'll be adding in just a little bit more dark. Take that right up into that area too. Okay, so this shape is not a good shape for a bush, so I'm going to push that out just a little bit more and bring this bush into that shape. We're always looking for good shapes when we paint. And now this dark area is going to come back here and it's going to make the front of the bush behind it as well. And one more of those at the back here, and then we'll be good to go. So pretty much the base of the bush is going to be dark all the way along. And now I'm going to just come in here and soften the edges of these so that they flow into the tree just a little bit more. A bit less of a sharp edge there. This is rather like the oak tree where we painted the oak tree. It's a similar idea. We soften the edges and then everything feels like it flows a little bit more. And we can come back and put the strongest dark on that afterwards. And on this one, for the pattern, the dark needs to go. I'm going to add a little bit more of the ultramarine blue to this to make it a darker blue-green. It's a good idea to test your colors to make sure you know where you're going. This one will work. So more often than not, we need a dark, a middle tone, and a light. And so this will actually end up being a little bit more like the middle tone on this one, most likely. Okay, I'm looking at the pattern of light and dark here, matching that pattern. And this is the next tree, and so that has to go in and out of the front tree to make the edge of the front tree have the right pattern. Can you see how that's working? Okay. Important that that goes in and out of that tree, and then it becomes its own tree and goes across there. Same thing here. This has to go in and out of this tree to make that tree work. And same thing here, just a little bit of in and out. Now we're getting very tiny little shapes back here. We're separating the shapes with light and shadow. As soon as that dries down a bit, we'll soften the edges just a little bit into the lights, and then we'll come back and put a strong dark in there. In the meantime, we're going to make a slightly darker tone for these guys. Prussian, cadmium, and a little burnt sienna. It's a bit too green, a bit too blue. Let's check it and see. It doesn't feel like a dark, warm green. It feels like a dark, cool green. So we need to warm it up a little bit more with the cadmium yellow and add a little burnt sienna too. Just a touch more of the blue. So we're pushing back the blue. We don't want quite as much of the blue. There we go. That's a little better, but that needs to be darker. So more burnt sienna and more of the Prussian to make it a dark, warm green. Okay, you see the difference? And that's going to be our little dark that we put in here. That kind of defines the edge of those bushes. Has a nice bushy feel. We're going to soften that down in a moment. Oftentimes the darks are small in areas like this. Might be a little bit more dark in there. And certainly along the base there will be more dark. Okay, now we're just going to soften that in towards the bush. Leave the edge that's in front of the light bush sharp, so that the bushes are feeling as though they're separated. So that's where it goes into the bush that you're going to soften it down just a little bit. Kind of feels like you're working backwards when you do this. A bit more dark there. Okay, and then the shadow under this one, on the ground, be that same blue-grey. And it's going to come out underneath the bushes like this. Maybe into the edges of the bushes. The shadow will go into just a little bit and then come forward. Just a little bit like that. So you'll get a bushy feel to the shadow. You'll see it more, and depending on the angle of the light, that's the kind of idea that you'll see with that one. This one needs just a little bit more dark in there, and not quite so much in there. Okay, we'll let that dry down. Everything's going to dry just a little bit lighter. And we're going to come in here with a slightly darker green tone. A bit more blue in the mix there. And we'll just put our slightly darker tone on the left of each of these. And then we'll soften the edge of that middle tone a little bit. That first dark that we put in. And we'll soften the edge of this one just a bit. Edges are important because edges are the way that we read paintings. The sharpest edge and the most contrast, the darkest dark against the lightest light, will be the area that you probably see first in a painting. And so you've got to be careful to make sure that that's where you want everybody to look. You're in charge. You're the artist. You get to choose that. To choose how that works. Let's push this back a little bit and add just a touch more dark in here. Soften this down just a wee bit. And by softening it, we're allowing some of those colors to move a bit, and we're making it less important in the middle of the tree, but more important on the edge of the tree. Okay, just add another couple of little branches up there on this one. Okay, just need a little separation here. We lost that separation a little bit, lost the light. So I'll just pull that back a bit. So we see that separation in between them. And that really means letting that paint dry just a little bit longer and not rushing it. Okay, that's enough, I think. And again, the shadows on this one are going to come in this direction, right? I've got the light going in the opposite way on this one, just because, actually no, I don't have the light going the opposite way. I have it going the same way. The shadows I'm going to put just a little differently on this one. And the shadows go in that direction on this one. There we go. Okay, now detail afterwards, once you finish this, if you need any dark detail or any particular lines within the trees, then the time to do that is right at the end, just like we did here on these trees. So we don't need a whole lot of detail. We just need it's more about light and shadow than it is about detail. Okay, so let's just take a look at those. And they just came from some pictures that I'm sure you can find just about anywhere. Pictures of variations of trees, different types of trees. I'll move this out of the way so you can see. And you can interpret these in any way you like, but it's a really good idea when you're painting in general to have a tonal study of what you're doing based on reality, and then translate that tone into color. And that way you won't lose that feeling of tone, of light and shadow. Okay, and light and shadow is the key to dimension, to making objects look dimensional. Really important that we use light and shadow for that. So understanding how light and shadow works and having a good light source is the beginning of the painting. And once you've got that, then you can work from there. So I hope you've enjoyed this little exercise on painting trees, and I will look forward to seeing you again. I'll say bye for now.